right, so this is our official variety trial here at the Macon Ridge Station. We've got an early maturing varieties and normal maturing varieties. We planted on November 2nd of last year. You can see we had a mishap at planting. We had a drill that clogged up, but all the plots are the same, so it's still a good test. And I think the yield potential is probably still above average out here. Dr. Harrison might argue with me on that one, but we put one herbicide shot out first week of December. It was Zidua at 3.25, and with metribuzin at 2 ounces to the acre. 50 pounds of fertilizer last week of January. 50 pounds in, it was 30,002. We were late getting the second shot out because we had an ice storm at the end of February, so the second shot went out March 4th. The same dose of fertilizer. We put P and K out prior to planting back in the fall. Half the trial is treated with the fungicide and the other half is not. And that fungicide is Miravis Ace at 13.7 ounces to the acre. Put that out on April 6th, and we put the second shot out Monday on April 20th. So, and I got a nice set of stripe rust notes out here. We've got some leaf rust starting. Plan to get scab notes as well. And Dr. Harrison spends more time out here than we do taking his notes. So for that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Harrison.
Thank you, and I appreciate Trey and Scott and all the people at Winnsboro that make it possible to do what we do. A couple of years ago, we decided that because scab was such a problem, that we needed to split the variety trial at some of our locations, Alexandria and Winnsboro being two of them, and have a highly protected variety trial with 3 replications, so reps 1, 2, and 3, and then the same varieties, non-protected reps 4, 5, and 6, which you've got on your book. And so what we're going to do today is go through the variety trials and talk a little bit about the varieties. I think we've only got one seedsman here. Seedsmen are welcome to chime in. The data from this variety trial, and we do take scab data here, but the most important scab data is from the misted nurseries that we stopped at first. So everything in this field, in the variety trials, is in replicated small plots in the misted inoculated scab nurseries. And in those nurseries, we'll hand harvest 300 heads, a row section, and we'll run that through a Vogel thrasher, a stationary thrasher with very little wind. Kelly gets to do this. This is my senior research associate Kelly and farm manager Chris, both of whom make it possible for the breeding program to exist because they put up with me. We run those through a thrasher, we collect the seed, clean them by hand, spend a lot of student labor money in the summer doing that. And then Kelly will take them and he will visually compare the seed to a standard that we have prepared of 0, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50% scabby kernels or fusarium damaged kernels. And so we'll rate every plot for FDK, and then we'll send that seed in to the USDA lab where it's ground and deoxynivalenol or mycotoxins are rated on them. So we spend a lot of effort with help from Trey and Boyd and others evaluating all of the wheat varieties that are available for fusarium head blight. Any questions? So we're going to walk through these fairly quickly. The fungicide protected rep is on that side. You can go through those on your own after we do the non-protected. This is Delta Grow 3500, which has been a very good wheat for us. It's a University of Georgia wheat. And if you look, we've got a tremendous stripe rust epidemic this year. I rated it at 60% stripe rust yesterday. Other than that, it's been a very good variety. This is a triticale field. For those of you that don't know triticale, it's a man-made hybrid between rye and wheat. So it has the R genome from rye and the A and B genomes from wheat. It doesn't really have very good bread making quality. It's a very good animal feed, makes good pancakes, but it's never really found a market.
What variety is that?
That's Trical 314. We use it as a marker in these variety trials. We frequently get entries from seedsmen way after the deadline. And so we always have 2 field spots in the variety trials where we can put in 2 late arriving entries. And so we had 1 this year, and this is the 2nd field spot. It makes a great marker in the field. This is a Florida breeding line, University of Florida. There is a group, a 7-university group called Sun Grains, Southeastern University of Grains, which is University of Florida, University of Georgia, Clemson University, North Carolina State, Texas A&M, LSU AgCenter, and University of Arkansas. And these breeders have basically one big breeding program. We share germplasm, we share grad students. We have a series of regional nurseries across all 7 states. So 15 years ago, a wheat variety, a wheat line coming out of the LSU breeding program was tested in Louisiana. And that was it until it was almost ready for release. With Sun Grains, we spend a lot of time testing each other's material. And so this year we have several hundred wheat breeding lines being tested all over the region. And the nice thing about that is I may develop a breeding line that's good, but not quite good enough for release, but it may be a barn burner in South Carolina. Well, the South Carolina breeder can steal it and increase it and release it because he's part of Sun Grains.
He pays a royalty.
He pays a royalty, that's right. We get a little bit out of it. Jimmy, AGS 2038.
Okay, I'll speak real quick.
Looks really good this year.
You go ahead and tell them the bad part.
Well, it's an older University of Georgia line that Ag South has. High yielding, it's a little tall. What's the bad part?
Well, it's old in the tooth. We need to have some. We need to have some FHB resistance in it. Before we get into the wheat, I want to say one thing. I travel all over looking at wheat farms, oat farms, corn, and some sustainable agriculture. Macon Ridge and Baton Rouge, y'all are the luckiest people you could ever be to have a station like this and a station like Baton Rouge. I equate this one to Virginia Tech and Carl Griffiths. Excuse me, but that's
Thank you
the
for
only
that.
one I can tell you that's anywhere near as good. And Carl retired. That's what scares me. 2038. It's an on medium late maturity wheat. It's got a very heavy test weight. It's got resistance to stripe rust. Thank goodness this year. It didn't get it real bad in this one. Soil-borne mosaic virus, powdery mildew. It's moderately resistant to Hessian fly. In Georgia and other states, we are having a serious problem with Hessian fly. It's a little bit resistant to gloom blotch and moderately resistant to barley yellow dwarf. In South Carolina, statewide, it did 95.1 bushels this past year. Thank you.
All right, the next one is AGS 3015, which is a relatively new variety that has done very well in the past. It was the 5th highest yielding line here last year in the early trial without a fungicide. If you look at it, you can see that this new stripe rust that has landed upon us this year is working it over pretty bad. I rated it at 50% stripe rust.
Blake Shepard's going to give an update on that one.
AGS 3015. It is a very early maturing wheat. It is you want to treat it, you want to plant it last, and you should be harvesting it first. It's going to come off a little bit earlier than everything else. Heavy test weight, stripe rust. As you said, we got bit a little bit on it this year. Moderately resistant to leaf rust, soil-borne mosaic, moderate resistant to gloom blotch, powdery mildew, barley yellow dwarf, and it is moderately resistant to FHB fusarium head blight.
Okay. Pioneer 26R94 is another early line. It was 9th out of 10 last year. It is fairly resistant to the new stripe rust. It's maybe a 5% MR reaction, moderately resistant reaction. It's another, all of the varieties in the early trial should be planted late. You plant early varieties late and late varieties early. The exception being 2038, which is here as a medium check, and 2055 that's here as a medium late check. AGS 2024 has done pretty well for us in the past, and it's been pretty resistant to stripe rust in the past, but it's another one that's running a 50% stripe rust this year. Now, if you look at the fungicide protected trial, it'll look beautiful. So this is a little biased because we're looking at it standing there naked. It looks better dressed up a little.
AGS 2024, obviously it's our own variety. We classify it as an early medium maturity in our neck of the woods over there. Heavy test weight, moderate resistance to powdery mildew, gloom bot, Hessian fly, and barley yellow dwarf. 2020, #1 in the Georgia OBT statewide for 3 years at 95.6 bushels. #7 in South Carolina statewide at 101.4 bushels. And #12 North Carolina statewide OBT at 81.4 bushels to the acre. And I did forget to mention the 3015 if I can.
Go ahead.
#8 South Carolina statewide OBT at 101.4, and #11 in Georgia OBT statewide. 3-year average at 88.5 bushels. Thank you.
All right. AGS 2055 we'll talk about in the normal trial. It's another check from the normal in the early so that we can kind of cross compare a little bit. This is a Florida experimental, and we won't go into the experimentals much because most of you are not really interested in them except for a few. Another Florida experimental that looks pretty good. And this is the girl I would invite to the prom. That's the one we were talking about. That's a 2016 double haploid. So this was a 2016 LSU cross that was the F1 seed were grown out and pollinated with corn pollen, which confused the heck out of it. It started to make an embryo, which it would normally abort and you'd get nothing out of it. But you can go in and tissue culture, embryo rescue it, tissue culture it, and you grow this little spindly haploid plant that has 1 copy of each chromosome, not 2. When it gets up and flowers, then when it gets some size on it, you treat it with colchicine, and that interferes with the mechanisms that separate the chromosomes out. And so instead of forming 2 duplicate chromosomes in 2 different cells, it doubles them. And so what you've got is 2 identical copies of every chromosome. And so it's a pure line, the first generation. A lot of what you do in plant breeding is taking out the garbage, letting these plants self-pollinate, and getting them to the point of being a pure line so you can yield test them. So this one, we were able to yield test the 3rd year after a cross instead of the 7th year. Double haploids cost a lot. We made 540 crosses this year. Most of them will come out of the pipeline 10 years from now. 6 of them maybe we'll put through a double haploid process, and it costs us $8,000 per cross to do a double haploid. So you can't do your whole program that way. It's a very expensive process. All right, any questions? It is very good. Let's see. It's very good. It's good on Hessian fly. It's good on scab. It's good on leaf rust. It's good on stripe rust. It's extremely promising. It did very well in the Sun Grains regional nurseries. It's being tested in all trials this year. We'll know, but I'll say yield is very good. Okay, so the normal trial, the variety trial is split into early and late or normal. The normal trial has about 60 entries in it this year, and so we'll go through just the release varieties. This is SY 547, Syngenta line. It yielded fairly well, 15th, 16th for 2 years and 1 year. It is moderately susceptible to scab, medium late, good for stripe rust, good for leaf rust. If you really pay attention, you'll see a lot of these things look very similar. It could be because they're identical, but I wouldn't say that. AgriMax 473, medium late, good for stripe rust, good for leaf rust. MR, MS sort of intermediate for scab. It was 31st out of however many lines have been tested for 2 years, about 35, I think. Looks pretty good this year. It's been a cool spring. Dynagrow Blanton is sort of a medium early. It is average yielding. It is susceptible to stripe rust, scab. This is a progeny experimental, second year in the trial, not released yet. Pioneer 26R41 is an old variety, but this is the first year in the test because it was in the test for about 6 years, and then they didn't test it for 2 years, and then they put it back in, so we don't have old data to compare it with that matches everything else, if that makes sense. AgriMax 492 I really like. It was the third highest yielding line in the test for 2 years. It's a medium maturity, good test weight, good stripe rust, good leaf rust, moderately resistant to fusarium, which is about as good as you get. So that's a really promising line for us. Georgia 17E8, first year in the trial, or second year in the trial, it was sort of average and moderately susceptible to scab. 18E26 is new to us this year. It's getting dinged up pretty good by stripe rust. Dynagrow 9811, another variety with a pretty high yield history. It was fourth highest for 2 years. Good test weight, good stripe rust, good leaf rust, but it is moderately susceptible to scab. You would definitely need a fungicide at heading on this variety. Progeny PGX 20-2 is new. AGS 3040. It's been a pretty good variety. It is moderately resistant to fusarium, which is important, but it really likes this new stripe rust. This is a new LSU breeding line, LA 15203, LD8 274. It's done pretty well for us in the past. We'll see how it does in the variety trial. Pioneer 26R45 is an older line with a good yield, not a great yield, but a good yield. It is moderately resistant to scab. It's a late maturing variety, so you need to plant it early. Dynagrow 9172 is new to us. This is LA 272, Progeny 19-12. Looks pretty good. It had the 7th highest yield in North Louisiana last year. Moderately late. We don't classify things for fusarium unless we've tested them for at least 2 years, because there's such a big interaction between timing of flowering and fusarium rating. And that's one reason for having the misted nurseries, is that everything is subjected to high fusarium pressure regardless. There's another LA breeding line, 15296. Looks pretty good. This is North Carolina 16 at 19288, a new line. Georgia 18E35, a new Georgia line. That looks more like it. This is LDH 200, a Louisiana experimental, that we have a fairly large increase of. Second year in the state trial, so we'll see where it goes. Georgia 18LE23F, new to the statewide trials, and it's going to have FHB1. When Jimmy mentioned V gene versus, what'd you say? Alleles. So there are 3 named FHB genes. FHB1 is the one that people call V gene. And it's a good one, but there are lots of what we call QTL, quantitative trait loci, which are other chromosome regions that aren't described in great detail, but that give good scab resistance. So there's probably 20 different QTL that we also track with molecular markers and utilize. USG 3640, pretty good yield for 2 years, intermediate for scab, it's got a low test weight. Here's another LA breeding line, LA 15166-296. Jimmy, I do have one without awns. Progeny 19-12, very good breeding line. Actually, it may be released now, I'm not sure. It's been in the test 1 year. It had the 7th highest yield last year. Here's another LA breeding line. This is 272. This line, we thought we were releasing last summer. We thought Lima Grain was releasing it, and then they kind of folded. So now we've got this line back in our hands, and we'll see what we do with it. Dynagro 9172, new to the test. Pioneer 26R45, that looks a lot more like it, Jimmy. It's late, it's got pretty good scab resistance, moderately resistant, good test weight, good stripe rust, good leaf rust. This is as far south as you want to come with this one.
Yes, sir.
and maybe it has burned a lot of people planting it in South Georgia, South Louisiana, and it doesn't hit out. It requires more cold than it gets. LDH 274, another Louisiana experimental, new to the state trials. We've obviously tested it quite a bit, and I think it looks really good. AGS 3040, pretty good yield, medium early. In the past, susceptible to stripe rust. Not this year. It has good fusarium resistance. Now this is a North Carolina experimental, very atypical for a North Carolina line. Usually they're late and awnless, but it's a pretty good looking variety of entry, first time in the plot. This is North Carolina 11546, new to the trial. Delta Grow 1500, also new to the trial. This is an LA experimental, 2nd year in the trial. This is LDH 112. It's one that we have a big increase of in South Georgia and may release this summer. Agramax 481 has been in the trial for 3 years now. It is moderately susceptible to scab and is very susceptible to the new stripe rust. Dynagro 9022 has been the one of the top yielders in North Louisiana. It is intermediate, it is moderately resistant to scab, it is resistant to stripe rust and leaf rust, so it's a good variety for us. Dynagro Riverland, 2nd year in the test, sort of average yield, and it's getting clobbered by stripe rust this year. Progeny PGX 18-7, moderately susceptible to scab. Liberty 5658 out of the Virginia Tech program. It is one of 3 that we classify as R to fusarium. Very good line for fusarium. I've got it stripe rust star from last year's data, but it's getting clobbered pretty good. So we've got a new race of stripe rust, and that happens. That's what keeps plant breeders employed, is the pathogen changes. It's an interesting gene for gene concept where there are many genes for resistance to stripe rust, but the pathogen has many genes for virulence to overcome those genes. And so if the pathogen is missing one virulence gene, then the variety is resistant. If they matched up, then it's no longer resistant. Delta Grow 1000, high yielding, medium late, moderately resistant to scab. It looks good for stripe rust and leaf rust. And then we're going to try to do this right this time. And go back, and we're at plot 4444 on your list. So we're going backwards from 4444. Progeny bullet, been tested for several years. Good but not great yield, moderately resistant, so it's got pretty good scab resistance. Good for leaf rust, good for stripe rust. This is an LSU experimental, LA 1280-LDH72, which we have 300 bushels of sitting in a warehouse in Georgia. We thought we were going to release it last summer, but we didn't quite like the results, so we sat on it to look at it again this year. Another LSU experimental, 1309. An Arkansas experimental that looks pretty good. A Georgia experimental that has the FHB1 gene, is very good for scab, good yield. It does not like this new stripe rust. Dynagrow plantation, moderately susceptible to scab and susceptible to stripe rust. This one is an old variety. That's LA 754 that was originally marketed by Terrell Seed. When Terrell went out of business, the rights were bought by Stratton Seed, and now it's marketed by Stratton. It's been kind of susceptible to stripe rust in the past. It's pretty resistant this year. AGS 2038 we've already talked about. It's an older variety that's hanging in there pretty well. SY Viper is a good North Louisiana wheat. Medium late, pretty good scab resistance. It's a moderately resistant. Good for stripe rust. It's a little susceptible to leaf rust, which we don't really have developed yet. It is out of the old Coker, AgriPro, Syngenta, and now GrowPro. Syngenta went out of business, and a group of 5 mom and pop seed companies bought this wheat operation, so now it's GrowPro. AgriMax 514 is new. LA 12275-56 is another one that we have a big increase of that we might release this summer. It is moderately resistant to scab, good test weight, pretty good yield. Plot 4445 is a North Carolina experimental, new to us, that looks pretty good. USG 3536, also new in the trial, looks pretty good. Dynagrow WX 20738, new to the trial, looks very good. I like that line. Of course, you can't look at one plot and really make a judgment, but it looks good there. Delta Grow 1200, new to the trial, also looks good. North Carolina 212835, new to the trial, out of the North Carolina State Breeding Program, which is a sun grains program, new to the trial. LANC 11558, second year in the trial. I had it in the trial last year. It was too susceptible to stripe rust, so I had a big seed increase. I sent the seed increase to Texas A&M and Clemson, where they don't have a stripe rust problem, because it looks very good. And so this year the stripe rust on it's going, and it looks very good here. It may wind up being released by Clemson and Texas A&M this fall. Let's see. Progeny 19-7. Second year, good yield. Intermediate scab, moderately early. Go Wheat 6000 is a Stratton seed release, our Stratton seed variety. It was developed by the University of Georgia, taken over and released by Texas A&M. It's another sun-grains wheat. Georgia 18 LE43F is another Georgia line that has very good scab resistance, but it's also being hammered pretty good by the new stripe rust. SY Ritchie, Syngenta Ritchie, high yield, medium late, moderately resistant to scab, pretty good scab resistance. It's a good North Louisiana line. It's one you don't want to go very far south with. This one is a LSU experimental, new to the trial. It has FHB1 and a couple of other QTL and very good scab resistance. It just doesn't quite get there yield-wise. We'll see what it does. And then we go back for the last range. Progeny PGX 20-8 is new to us, looks decent. Syngenta experimental, new to us, looks decent. University of Arkansas line is new to us. It's pretty well getting hammered by stripe rust. All right, Jimmy, here's AGS 2055, or one of you. AGS 2055 is a good standard. It's extremely high yielding in Arkansas, does well in North Louisiana. 6th highest yield for 2 years in North Louisiana. Decent stripe rust is getting some here. Good leaf rust. It is susceptible to scab. Delta Grow 1800. Nice looking wheat for North Louisiana. It's one that's classified as resistant to scab, so it's one to keep your eyes on. It does good in South Louisiana. It's medium early, and that's about it. It's a pretty good line. Progeny PGX 20-11 is new. LW 2026 is new to the trial. Here's an Arkansas experimental that has looked pretty good. This is AR 90137 out of the University of Arkansas program. Second year in the trial. It was 13th highest yield last year. This one is an LA experimental. Moderately resistant to scab, looks decent. I see a little barley yellow dwarf virus down here on the end. This is a Syngenta experimental that looks very good, first year in the trial. And this is Pioneer 26R59. Pretty high yielding, moderately susceptible to scab, good stripe rust, a little bit susceptible to leaf rust. And that is it for the trial. If you want to